The stolen moonshine burned my throat, but it was the only thing numbing the rotting mate mark hidden under my wet hair. The most ruthless alpha king in the world stared down at me, trespassing in his bath. If he sees my rejected scar, Packlaw demands he rip my wolf from my chest. So I looked up at the terrifying predator, gave a drunken, desperate smile, and told him to get in. Chapter 1. Pure bleach burned the back of Sienna's throat, sharp enough to strip paint, and just strong enough to mask the copper tang of dying flesh. She dragged a stiff brush across the white marble of the royal bathtub, grinding the plastic handle into her bleeding knuckles. Scrubbing meant movement, and movement kept her mind off the rot eating its way down her neck. Packlaw left no room for broken bonds. A rejected female hiding a severed mark was nothing but meat, waiting for the executioner's blade. The infection pulsed, a hot, wet throb beneath the cheap cotton of her grey uniform. Trembling fingers caught the metal zipper at her collar. She dragged it down. Under the harsh, fluorescent glare, jagged black veins crawled across her collarbone like cracked glass. Near the memory of Cale turning his back, in the freezing snow, still sat like a stone in her gut. But right now, survival demanded she shut it out. She needed the ache to stop. Steam rolled off the scalding bath water, slicking the gilded mirrors with sweat. On the edge of the vanity sat a crystal decanter of alpha-grade moonshine. Dropping the scrub brush, she let the plastic clatter against the tile. Silence stretched out in the ringing bathroom, broken only by the hiss of hot water hitting porcelain. She ripped the glass stopper free. Tipping the rim back, she swallowed the amber fire whole. The liquor clawed its way down her throat, tasting like gasoline and ruined decisions. Coughing up the fumes, she wiped her mouth with a wet sleeve and drank again, until the sharp corners of the room began to dull. Without bothering to strip, she threw one leg over the edge of the porcelain tub. Scalding water swallowed her boots, soaking instantly through her wool trousers and dragging her down into the heat. The temperature hit her infected wound like a lit match. Biting down on a scream, she tasted blood, sinking until the water lapped at her chin. The solid oak door unlatched. A shadow swallowed the doorway, blocking the hall light. Her lungs froze. The royal guards never entered the sanctuary without permission, which left only one predator, bold enough to walk in unannounced. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, cracked against the floorboards. Dust motes danced in the sudden shift of air. A low, territorial vibration rattled the glass decanter still clutched in her fist. She didn't scramble backward. She didn't beg. Dragging her chin up from the water, she tightened her grip on the crystal and stared directly into the gold eyes of the Alpha King.
Frost still clung to Ronan's bare shoulders from the training yard, melting into the thick wall of heat trapped inside his private washroom. He crossed the threshold, expecting the sterile bite of cleaning supplies. Instead, the sickening stench of decayed pine needles slammed into a crisp, tart wave of crushed citrus. He stopped. Water dripped from his wet hair onto the tiles. A feral growl scraped against his vocal cords, demanding blood from whatever intruder had breached his inner sanctum. Yet, his boots stayed planted. The violent surge of adrenaline crashed into a sudden, crushing instinct to protect. Peering through the dense curl of steam, he located the source. A tiny, soaked female sat chest-deep in his scalding water. Clothed in a ruined servant's uniform, she looked like a drowned rat, but pale skin stretched tight over fragile bones, screaming of sickness. But her chin tilted upward, snapping with an insane, cornered defiance. The glass decanter scraped against the wet marble rim. She shoved a cut crystal tumbler toward the edge. "You look tense, Your Majesty," she slurred, the words grinding out like crushed gravel. "Get in or get out. You're letting the draft in." Air stalled in Ronan's lungs. No one spoke to him. Not like this. Naked and wired from brutal combat, he possessed every legal right to snap her neck before the water grew cold. His enforcers lived to slaughter trespassers. But the muscle fibers in his thighs locked. A pathetic, foreign whine scratched at the back of his mind. She didn't flinch. Tipping the bottle back, she took another drag of his private reserve. Reaching backward, his hand found the brass handle of the oak door. The lock clicked into place, a sharp snap echoing off the tile. He stalked forward. With every barefoot stride, the sickly sweet scent of a severed mate bond grew stronger, bleeding directly from the collar of her soaked uniform. A dead woman walking. His chest cracked open, spilling unearned grief for a stranger. Stopping at the edge of the tub, his shadow completely eclipsed her small frame. "You are drinking my moonshine," he rumbled. "It's good," she whispered. Trembling fingers extended the tumbler toward his chest. His knees hit the hard floor. He hadn't commanded them to bend, but his body yielded, dragging him down until he sat eye level with the dying girl. Reaching out, his scarred thumb grazed her freezing knuckles. A spark of static ripped up his forearm. He sucked a breath through his teeth, eyes snapping wide as a blinding pulse of liquid gold detonated from the center of her chest, setting the steam on fire.
Morning light bled through the blackout drapes, cutting a gold line across the floorboards. The air smelled of wood smoke and rain. Silk draped over Sienna's throat, slick and suffocating. Pain hammered her skull. Copper coated her tongue. Peeling her eyelids, back against the glare, a spike of panic pierced her chest. She had survived the tub. She had escaped the dungeon. Instead, she lay drowning in the center of a sprawling mattress. The room remained tomb quiet. A clock ticked somewhere in the shadows. Her ragged uniform had vanished. Instead, she wore a cotton shirt, smelling of pine and ozone. Her fingers drifted to her collarbone. Gauze wrapped tight around the infected bite. Someone had scrubbed the wound clean. Predators did not patch up their prey. Memories hit her in flashes, the cold tile, stolen liquor, the king crashing to his knees. The light blinding her before everything snapped to black. Pushing up on trembling elbows, she scanned the room. The suite stretched out, drowned in shadows. She swung her legs toward the edge. Then she saw the shape. Ronan slept on the hardwood at the foot of the bed. A wool blanket covered his waist. He had surrendered his territory for a tainted stray. Her blood pounded in her ears. She swallowed hard, tasting ash. Escape. She had to run before he woke and changed his mind. She didn't know his games or how to survive his wrath. Swinging her bare feet over the edge, her toes brushed the floorboards. A fist hammered against the door. Dust motes jumped in the sunlight. The brass handle rattled. "Your Majesty!" A nasal voice barked from the corridor. "Dr. Aris? Mandatory inspection?" Sienna froze, and staring at the turning knob as the lock clicked open.
Shadows clung to the corners of the antechamber. Outside, the wind howled against the glass. Adrenaline flooded Ronan's veins before his eyes even snapped open. Behind him, silk rustled. Sienna sucked in a ragged breath. Her terror flooded the room, tasting like acid in the back of his throat. His beast clawed at his ribs, fully prepared to slaughter the staff to keep her safe. He pushed off the floorboards without a sound. His muscles coiled tight. The knocking echoed again. Aris. If the doctor smelled the rot on her neck, Pack Law demanded a swift execution. He needed a shield. The floorboards chilled his bare feet. Snatching a robe, he dragged the fabric over his shoulders. "I am coming, Aris." His voice rumbled low enough to rattle the window panes. Stepping toward the entrance, he cracked the door an inch. His frame blocked the gap completely. Aris stood in the corridor, clutching a silver kit. "Sire, health inspection." Aris pushed forward, attempting to peer around the king. Ronan's claws snapped out. They bit deep into the doorframe. Splinters rained onto the carpet. He forced his breathing to slow, knowing bloodshed would only summon the guard. "No medical inspection today," Ronan stated coldly. "But ancient law states, law bends to my will." Ronan stepped into the gap, crowding the doctor. The lie formed instantly, cold and unbreakable. "My wolf has grown unstable. I secured a personal scent keeper. Her scent alone keeps my beast from slaughtering this court. Her presence is classified. This room is restricted." Aris went rigid. A contract bypassed every mandate in the mountains, binding a female to the king for biological survival. It locked her in a steel cage of his making. "I understand, Your Majesty," Aris stammered, taking a quick step back. The hallway quieted. Distant boots marched down a different corridor. Ronan's claws retracted slowly into his knuckles. But Aris didn't leave. The doctor reached into his coat, sliding a rolled parchment through the crack near Ronan's boots. "An urgent seal, sire," Aris whispered. Ronan stared down at the red wax. It bore the crest of a border territory. Alpha Kale, the male who had shattered Sienna, waited at the palace gates.
After Ronan had forced her to sign the impromptu scent keeper contract that morning to save her life, he hadn't let her out of his sight, marching her straight into his private study. Afternoon sun bled through the arched windows, cutting hot, dusty stripes across the library floorboards. The air tasted of dry parchment and bitter lemon wax. Sienna pressed her spine against the oak bookshelves. The carved wood dug sharply into her shoulder blades. Instead of a dungeon, she was locked in a fortress of ink and leather. The scent keeper contract legally bound her to the king's shadow. A thick volume pressed into her chest, held tight against her ribs like a makeshift armor plate. She tracked the floorboards, waiting for the strike. Punishments always came, eventually. Across the room, parchment scraped against mahogany. Ronan didn't roar, had no royal orders, dragged her to her knees. The king simply traced a scarred finger down the length of an ancient scroll. "You are standing too far away, Sienna." His voice rumbled low, vibrating against the glass of the display cases. Sienna's grip tightened on the book cover. Her boots remained planted on the rug. A servant survived by staying invisible, but a cornered stray survived by keeping distance. He didn't look up. A single dark claw tapped the arm of a velvet chair stationed inches from his desk. "Sit. The contract requires close proximity." The ticking of the grandfather clock swallowed the silence. Moving on pure survival instinct, she pushed off the shelves. Her boots scuffed the floorboards. She sank into the velvet cushions. Instantly, the sharp bite of winter pine and ozone washed over her. The scent choked out the sour rot leaking from the bandage on her neck. Her spine hit the chair back. The tension bleeding out of her muscles felt like a highly dangerous trap. Then the iron grates of the overhead vents rattled. The draft changed direction. Pine gave way to something else. Stale, rotting roses pumped directly into the sealed room. Sienna's fingers dug into the leather binding. The scent of the monster who broke her was inside the walls.
Torches hissed along the limestone walls of the great hall, baking the air with a smell of burning pitch and roasting meat. From the high observation balcony, Ronan stared down at the sprawling crowd of diplomats. Voices echoed off the vaulted ceiling, melting into a dull, irritating roar. Down on the main floor, a man in black wolf fur swaggered through the arched entryway. Alpha Kale. Ronan gripped the smooth stone of the balustrade. A king welcomed guests. A king played the political game. But the beast pacing under his skin clawed violently at his sternum, demanding a slaughter. He didn't know why until the draft carried the border lord's scent up to the rafters. Stale, rotting roses. Ronan stopped breathing. The bitter sting of copper coated the back of his throat. It was the exact stench baked into the collar of Sienna's ruined shirt. The sour rot of fear. The scent of the male who had ripped into her flesh and left her to die on the tiles. Under his palms, the marble ledge gave way with a sharp crack. White stone dust drifted down into the torchlight. Small chunks of rubble hit the floorboards below. Nobody looked up. Ronan stared at his white-knuckled grip, waiting for the ringing in his ears to fade. Swallowing the acid in his throat, he fought the physical pressure building behind his eyes. The urge to vault over the railing and rip the border lord apart nearly blinded him. Slowly, he forced his fingers to open. Blood dripped from his palms where his own claws had pierced his skin. He had to be strategic. A feral king could not protect a broken mate. He wiped the blood on his dark slacks, turning toward the stairs. Down below, Kyle stopped in the dead center of the hall. The arrogant border lord reached inside his fur coat. Ronan froze halfway to the steps. Kyle raised his fist high above his head. Pinched between his fingers was a torn, blood-stained scrap of gray cotton. It was a pack cleaner's uniform. Smiling at the crowd, the alpha turned in a slow circle, displaying the ruined fabric to the entire court.
The moment the king had stepped out to the observation balcony, Sienna had bolted from the library, desperate for 5 minutes alone to inspect the burning rot on her neck. The bathroom smelled of bleach and cedar. Sconce light flickered, casting a yellow glow across the porcelain sink. Sienna gripped the cold edge, locking her knees to keep from collapsing. Fire crawled across her collarbone. She dug her fingernails under the edge of the medical tape. The adhesive ripped loose with a wet tear. Dark blood soaked the gauze. The stench of spoiled copper hit her throat. She swallowed hard against the rising bile. Biting her bottom lip, she tasted fresh blood, refusing to make a sound. A shadow blocked the doorway. Ronan stepped onto the tiles. The scent of winter pine pushed the rot out of the cramped room. He didn't speak. His boots crossed the floorboards. "Stop!" His voice vibrated against the mirror glass. "You are tearing your skin." Before she could flinch away, his scarred fingers wrapped around her wrist. The heat of his palm sank straight to her bones. Gently, he peeled her hand back. He took the ruined gauze and dropped it into the brass bin. Turning to the counter, he ran a clean cloth under the hot tap. "It is disgusting," she choked out. A single tear cut a track down her cheek. "It is proof of survival," he countered. He twisted the cloth, wringing out the steaming water. He pressed the damp linen to her neck. The scalding heat shocked the venom, numbing the sharpest edges of the pain. He wiped the blackened infection away with slow, deliberate strokes. His thumb slipped, brushing the jumping pulse point at the base of her throat. A jolt of pure static cracked between their skin. The rotting veins beneath his finger flared with bright silver light.
Drafts howled through the servant corridors, carrying the smell of damp earth and lye soap. Ronan stalked through the shadows. The muscles in his back coiled tighter with every step, tracking a rot that did not belong in his mountain. Stale roses. The border lord's scent coated the back of Ronan's tongue. He rounded the sharp corner. Down the hall, Cale trapped Sienna against the limestone wall. The lesser alpha leaned close, his fur coat brushing her shoulder. "Look at you," Cale sneered. Hiding in a palace, but still just a stray. Cale reached out. His fingers grazed her collar. Logic shattered. The beast tore through the cage. Ronan crossed the stone floor in a silent blur. His fist locked into the collar of Kyle's coat. He ripped the male backward, spinning him like a rag doll. "Do not touch her." Ronan's growl rattled the iron sconces on the wall. With a violent heave, he launched Kyle across the corridor. The border lord slammed into the opposite wall. Stone dust rained down onto the flagstones. Kyle slumped to the floorboards, gasping for air. The dripping of a leaky pipe echoed down the empty hall. Ronan tasted copper. His chest heaved, pulling in jagged rips of air. The ringing in his ears slowly faded, leaving only the sour stench of the border lord clinging to the stones. Snatching a damp rag from a linen cart, Ronan closed the distance. He pinned Sienna against the wall with his body. Crushing the coarse cloth to her neck, he scrubbed the skin above her collarbone. He had to erase Kale. He had to burn the scent away. "I will kill him," Ronan muttered to the stones. "Or I will burn his territory to ash." He dragged the cloth harder against her skin, fully consumed by the hunt. Then small fingers dug into his forearm. Sienna did not cower. Her grip clamped tight around his wrist, halting the violent motion of the cloth completely.
Cut glass chandeliers burned like ice against the vaulted ceiling of the grand dining hall. The heat of 100 bodies packed the room, smelling of expensive wool, roasting venison, and cloying perfume. Sienna sat spine straight in a velvet chair beside the Alpha King. The noise of clinking silver and overlapping conversations battered against her skull. She kept her chin tucked. A servant survived by disappearing, but the scent keeper contract tethered her to the head of the long table. Hundreds of eyes kept dragging back to her face, assessing the stray sitting in the seat of power. Beside her, Ronan radiated the heat of a furnace. His broad shoulder occasionally brushed her arm. Every time he shifted, the scent of winter pine pushed back the stench of sour wine and cigar smoke, drifting from the visiting diplomats. Her fingers traced the rim of an empty crystal flute. The banquet felt wrong. The air hummed with a tight, electric pressure. Earlier that afternoon, she had watched Alpha Kale slip a gold coin into the head steward's palm near the kitchens. That quiet exchange dug a hole in her stomach. Beneath the bandages on her neck, the ruined mate mark pulsed with a strange phantom heat. Down the table, a fork clattered against a porcelain plate. A tall courtier in a teal suit stepped out of the crowd. He stopped directly behind Sienna's chair. The sharp reek of gin and stale cigars washed over her neck. "A toast," the courtier barked. He raised a half-empty glass, his voice cutting through the dull roar of the room. "To cleaning up the palace." He leaned down, his breath hot against her ear. "Starting with this useless stray." Sienna's chest locked. The air in the room turned to sludge. Kyle's gold coin made sense now. The border lord had paid this man to rip her secrets open. The executioner's block suddenly felt inches away. Her boots stayed frozen to the floorboards. If she ran, the royal guard would bring her down before she reached the double doors. The courtier laughed. His sweaty fingers grabbed the metal zipper at the collar of her uniform. "Let us see what kind of filth the king keeps," the man sneered. The metal teeth of the zipper dragged downward with a sharp, ugly screech.
The roar of the dining hall vanished. Inside Ronan's skull, the world dropped into a flat, dead calm. He stared at the courtier's hand gripping Sienna's collar. He saw the violent flinch of his mate's shoulders. The scent of her terror spiked, tasting like battery acid on his tongue. The beast under his ribs didn't roar. It didn't snarl. It simply took control with cold, mechanical precision. A stray touched the Alpha King's mate. The punishment for that was already written in stone. Ronan didn't stand up. He didn't bare his teeth. His fingers closed around the handle of his silver steak knife. The metal felt cold against his palm. He lifted the blade from the white linen. In a blur of motion, he brought the knife down in a brutal, horizontal arc. The silver edge sheared cleanly through bone, tendon, and teal suit fabric. The courtier's severed hand hit the marble floor with a wet slap. The metal zipper on Sienna's collar slipped from the dead fingers. Silence slammed into the dining hall. The music stopped. Breathing stopped. Blood pulsed in a hot, arterial rhythm from the courtier's stump, spraying bright red droplets across the pristine white tablecloth. The man stared at his missing hand. A high, ragged scream tore from his throat, echoing off the stone arches. Ronan sat back in his carved chair. His face remained carved from granite. He picked up a silk napkin and methodically wiped the blood from the silver blade. Setting the knife down, he turned to Sienna. He reached out, his knuckles brushing the pale skin of her throat. With slow, deliberate care, he pulled the zipper back to her chin, hiding the bandaged mark. And the heat of his fingers left a trail of fire against her freezing skin. "Someone mop up this mess," Ronan stated. His voice barely rose above a whisper, yet it carried to the furthest corners of the hall. "He is staining the floor." Guards materialized from the shadows, dragging the screaming courtier by his armpits toward the servant corridors. The smear of blood on the marble looked black in the candlelight. The sweet, metallic stench of copper filled the room. The court stared in absolute, rigid terror. Ronan had just built a fortress of violence around a pack cleaner. At the far end of the long table, a chair scraped against the stone. Alpha Kale stood up. The border lord did not look at the blood on the floor. A smug, triumphant smile twisted his mouth. Kale reached into his fur coat. He pulled out a rolled parchment, stamped with a thick red wax seal of the High Council.
When the council warrant hit the banquet table, the grand hall had erupted into screaming chaos. Using the blood-soaked distraction, Sienna had slipped through the servants' exit and fled into the mountain pass to keep Ronan from starting a full-scale war. Wind stripped the warmth from Sienna's bones the second she breached the tree line. Ice crystals bit into her cheeks like shattered glass. Waist-deep snow dragged at her boots, turning the jagged mountain pass into a frozen cage. She pulled the edges of a stolen cloak across her chest. Frost coated her eyelashes. The council scroll had branded her as border property. Staying meant war. Staying meant Ronan's blood, painting the marble floors. A stray didn't drag a king down. She forced her frozen legs forward, carving a trench through the drifts. The storm screamed through the pines, drowning out the crunch of her footsteps. She expected the cold to claim her. She expected to freeze in the dark. Then a strange heat flickered at the base of her throat. The rotting infection beneath her bandages stopped burning. Instead, a surge of silver warmth pumped directly into her freezing veins. It pushed the numbness out of her fingertips. Her gums ached. A low, vibrating hum rattled behind her ribs. Snow crunched ahead of her. The wind died down for a fraction of a second. 3 men in winter gear stepped out from the shadow of a granite cliff. Ice crunched again. Alpha Kyle walked slowly through the center of the formation. Iron links clanked against his leather gloves. "Going somewhere, little stray?" Kale shouted over the gale. The silver heat in Sienna's blood flared, burning the cold away completely as she braced her boots against the ice, ready to fight.
The grandfather clock ticked inside the empty suite. Embers popped in the stone fireplace, throwing orange light across the floorboards. Ronan stood paralyzed at the foot of the bed. The mattress was cold. A cotton shirt rested neatly on the pillows. Beside the fabric sat the yellow parchment of the council. Her citrus scent still hung in the stagnant air, slowly fading into nothing. He stared at the empty fabric. Oxygen stopped reaching his lungs. The ringing in his ears pitched into a deafening whine. He tasted copper. The political chessboard burned to ash inside his mind. Kyle had hunted in his territory. A roar tore out of his throat, fracturing the crystal chandelier above him. Glass tinkled to the floorboards. Fine dust drifted down from the plaster ceiling. Ronan swallowed the acid burning his throat. staring at the glittering shards on the rug. He didn't fight the beast clawing at his sternum. He surrendered. Bones snapped, muscle tore and reformed. Agony blinded him as coarse fur ripped through his skin. His golden irises bled into crimson. The wolf did not turn toward the oak door. It lowered its snout and charged the balcony. Reinforced glass shattered on impact. Shards rained into the dark as the black beast plummeted into the blizzard. Paws hit the snowbanks at a dead sprint. The storm whipped at his face, carrying the sour stench of stale roses. High above him, a raw scream cut completely through the howling wind.
Ice crusted over Sienna's eyelashes. The wind screamed through the mountain pass, driving freezing snow into the folds of her stolen cloak. Over the howl of the storm, iron links clanked together. Kyle stood 10 paces away. He wrapped a suppression collar around his leather glove, letting the excess chain swing like a pendulum. The jagged teeth of the iron caught the moonlight. Sienna backed up until her spine hit the solid permafrost of the cliff wall. 3 trackers flanked the border lord, their boots carving deep trenches into the drifts. There was no path forward. The reek of rotting roses choked out the clean scent of pine. "Time to leash the stray," Kale shouted over the gale. He lunged. Kyle slammed her against the ice. His fingers dug into her shoulder, pinning her in place. The iron collar hovered an inch from her throat, irradiating a freezing ache. The infection under her bandages stopped burning. A jolt of pure static cracked down her spine. The heat hit her bloodstream like a physical blow. The snow packed around her boots hissed, melting instantly into water. Sienna didn't flinch, her vision washed in a brilliant gold tint. Reaching up, she wrapped her bare hands around the iron links. The metal smoked against her palms. She twisted her wrists. The collar snapped with a sharp crack. Kyle stared at the broken chain in his hand. The wind whipped between them, carrying the smell of ozone. Sienna grabbed the lapels of his fur coat. Yanking him forward, she drove her forehead directly into the center of his face. Cartilage crunched under the impact. Kyle stumbled backward. He hit the snowbank, blood pouring from his ruined nose. Sienna tasted copper on her own lip, her knuckles burning from the hot iron. Scrambling to his knees, Kyle dug into his coat. He ripped a loaded crossbow from his harness, leveling the silver-tipped bolt directly at her chest.
Blizzard winds battered the jagged peaks. The storm carried a toxic blend of copper and stale roses down the icy cliffs. A black blur tore through the drifts. Paws the size of dinner plates shattered the ice crust. Ronan felt nothing but the thrumming drive to kill. The crown didn't matter. The treaties burned to ash. He was a weapon, forged only to protect a mate. He launched himself off a granite boulder. The wolf crashed into the clearing, landing between Sienna and the border lord. Snow sprayed into the air like shattered glass. Before the guards could pivot, the beast struck. He lunged sideways, his jaws locking onto a tracker's throat. Bones snapped. Tossing the body into the dark, he spun. Razor claws gutted the second man, painting the drifts a violent crimson. Kale dropped his crossbow. The weapon clattered against the ice. The wolf stalked forward. The stench of Kale's terror rolled off him in waves. Ronan pounced. He pinned the border lord to the permafrost, his weight crushing the air from Kale's lungs. Teeth sank into winter fur and flesh. He tore the male apart. Silence dropped over the mountain pass. The wind died to a low whistle. Blood dripped from the wolf's jaw, melting small holes in the snow. His chest heaved, pulling in jagged rips of air. He swallowed the thick taste of copper, waiting for the drumming in his skull to stop. The wolf was entirely consumed by the slaughter. Behind him, a boot crunched in the snow. The feral beast did not register the citrus scent. He turned his head. Glowing red eyes locked onto Sienna. The wolf bared his dripping fangs, and a low, rattling growl vibrated from deep inside his chest.
Clouds broke over the mountain pass, letting stark moonlight spill across the slaughter. The wind died to a hollow whistle. Blood soaked into the snowdrifts, smelling sharply of copper and ripped fabric. 10 feet away, the feral wolf stood over a mangled corpse. The beast turned its head. Crimson irises locked onto Sienna. A mechanical growl vibrated through the permafrost, rattling the soles of her boots. She did not step back. A stray survived by running, but an alpha survived by holding the line. As she dropped to her knees, crushed ice soaked instantly through her denim jeans. She reached up to her throat. Her fingers hooked the edge of her torn collar. With a sharp tug, she ripped the bloody fabric away. The freezing air bit into her ruined skin. The wolf tracked the movement. The muscle bunched under dark fur as the beast stalked forward. Paws crunched in the red slush. Sienna tilted her chin up. She forced her shoulders down, exposing her throat completely. The beast stopped inches away. Steaming breath washed over her collarbone, carrying the metallic reek of the kill. Her pulse beat, a slow, steady rhythm against her carotid artery. "Mine," she stated. Her voice cut through the freezing air like a steel blade. "Stand down." The growl choked off in the wolf's throat. Silence stretched across the clearing. The scent of rotting roses vanished, swallowed completely by the sharp bite of winter pine and sweet citrus. The crimson fire slowly bled out of the beast's eyes, leaving a familiar fractured gold. Then the dark scar on her neck erupted in blinding heat. Bones snapped. Fur receded into bruised flesh. The monster collapsed into the snowbank, violently restructuring back into a man. Ronan hit the ice on his hands and knees. His chest heaved, pulling in desperate, jagged gasps of freezing air. He dragged himself forward through the slush. Wrapping his arms around her waist, he buried his face in the crook of her neck, right over the burning mark. Tears soaked into her freezing skin. She threaded her fingers into his dark hair, gripping tight as the searing heat of her new crest welded them together in the dark.
Morning sunlight fractured through the stained glass windows of the grand hall, painting the marble floor in shards of red and gold. Dust motes drifted in the heated air. The room smelled of lemon wax, polished steel, and the sour sweat of 200 nervous aristocrats. Ronan stood at the apex of the grand staircase. The gold crown dug a familiar, dull ache into his temples. Down below, the entire mountain court waited in total silence. His knuckles brushed against Sienna's fingers. She wore a high-collared black dress, her spine straight as a forged blade. A few hours ago, she was bleeding in the snow. Now, she stood over the wolves who had mocked her. Ronan stared out at the sea of upturned faces. He tasted phantom copper on his tongue, the ghost of Kale's blood lingering in his mouth. He swallowed hard, waiting for the echo of the mountain wind to fade from his ears. The beast inside his ribs purred, completely calm. He turned his body toward Sienna. Reaching out, his scarred fingers caught the edge of her dark hair. He pushed the thick strands over her shoulder, fully exposing the skin of her neck to the court below. Nobody breathed. The silk of her dress rustled in the quiet hall. The aristocrats craned their necks, hunting for the rotting infection of a broken stray. Instead, a flawless silver crest rested flush against her collarbone. The ancient mark of the Alpha Queen pulsed with a faint bioluminescence in the morning light. A collective gasp echoed off the vaulted ceiling. Knees hit the marble floor. One by one, the visiting diplomats and proud courtiers collapsed into deep bows. The scent keeper lie was dead. A divine bond had taken its place. Ronan dropped his hand, a rough smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. He stepped back, yielding the floor. Sienna did not look at him for permission. Her golden eyes tracked over the bowing crowd as she stepped up to the carved throne, her boots clicking sharply against the stone, claiming a brutal kingdom entirely as her own.